Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Now, Fahrenheit 451 was originally published as a short story entitled The Fireman, which was published in Galaxy Science Fiction in 1950. Bradbury later expanded the story into a full-length novel, which was published in 1953, and then in 1954 the novel was serialized in Playboy magazine. Now, I did do a review of this book before, a number of years ago. It was actually one of my earlier reviews, and I actually remember I reviewed this as part of a little special I was doing on dystopian novels, and I reviewed this alongside stuff like George Orwell's Animal Farm and George Orwell's 1984 and Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange and Stephen King's The Running Man and Stephen King's The Long Walk. Since I've done that special, I have re-reviewed The Running Man, and now I'm re-reviewing this book. And I did take down my old review of this book. Now, the plot of Fahrenheit 451 is it's set in America in an unspecified time in the future. It doesn't say when. All you know is what's been going on in the society of this novel has been going on for decades. So, this could be anything from 50 to 100 years from when the book was originally published. And in the future American society of this novel, reading books is forbidden, and in this future most houses are fireproof, so firemen, instead of putting out fires, actually start fires, specifically to burn books. And in this society, the public is completely controlled by the media and are actually encouraged to turn in anybody who they suspect of keeping books. Now, the story follows a man named Guy Montag, who is a fireman, who in the beginning of the novel meets this teenage girl named Clarice, who at first he thinks is kind of an odd duck because she does things that people in this society don't do. She examines her life and the lives of people around her. And she asks him this question that really sets him on this path throughout the entire novel. Are you happy? And throughout the novel, Montague realizes that he's not happy. The issue is, this is a society that's obsessed with being happy at the expense of actual knowledge and actual free thought. And this is also a society that's obsessed with equality. Now, of course, equality is a good thing, and I don't think Bradbury is saying that equality isn't good, but it's equality at the expense of any sort of individuality. And eventually in the story, when Montague and his fellow firemen were going to burn a bunch of these books, the woman who had these books actually burns herself alive with them because she would rather be dead than have her books taken away from her. And that's when he really starts to question not just himself, but the society around him, and he actually starts reading books, and throughout the course of the story you see him try to rebel against the system and what the system made him. Now, Fahrenheit 451 is an excellent book. Now, I first read this book in high school, or I should say, I was in high school at the time I read this, but I didn't read it for a class, I read this on my own time. But when I read this back in high school, I absolutely loved it, but after rereading it, I was actually really struck by how prescient the book is, and how relevant the themes of the novel are even today. Actually, this book is arguably even more relevant today than when Bradbury wrote this back in the 50s. And this is also a masterpiece of the dystopian genre, and it's a masterpiece of science fiction literature. What's interesting is Bradbury, who's considered to be one of the greatest science fiction authors to ever live, actually said that this is his only true science fiction novel. Like everything else he wrote, he considered to be more in the realm of fantasy. This is really the only book he wrote where he considered the future of this novel truly plausible, and he considered this to be his only true science fiction story. Now, in the book, there's very much the theme of atomic warfare. Like, throughout the novel, you realize that this war is approaching, and it's in all likelihood going to be a nuclear war. And that was definitely reflecting fears and anxieties at the time, because this was the early 1950s. This was right at the beginning of the Cold War, and this was only a few years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And you could tell this book is very much sort of commentating on that. What's interesting, though, is Bradbury in later years actually seemed to regret including the themes of atomic warfare in this book. Like, I think he felt like it sort of distracted from the main themes of the book, and actually when they were making the first film adaptation of this book, Bradbury actually advised the director of that movie to exclude those themes from the movie. But personally, I feel like that adds such an oppressive atmosphere to this novel, because throughout the book, you really do get this sense that this is a society on the verge of collapse. Of course, it's outside forces that are responsible for this collapse, but at the same time, though, in a lot of ways, it is their own fault as well, because this society is so ignorant that they don't even realize that they're on the brink of destruction, and maybe if they were a little smarter, maybe something could have been done about it. And the ending of the book is very bleak, because it literally ends with a bang. At the same time, though, there is a sense of optimism to the ending as well, because the ending very much suggests that society can rebuild itself, but it's up to the readers and the thinkers and the intellectuals to rebuild society. Now, a lot of people compare this book to George Orwell's 1984, and in a lot of ways, both this and 1984 are almost considered to be the pinnacles of the dystopian genre. And while the two books are very similar, I would argue that 1984 is darker. And while Fahrenheit 451 does have a bleak ending, there is still some hope in the story, whereas in 1984, there was no hope whatsoever. Like, 1984 was one of the most brutally nihilistic novels I've ever read, especially in the dystopian genre. Now, Bradbury has commented on the comparisons between his book and 1984, and what he brought up is he considers 1984 to be a much more political novel than his book. And Orwell wrote 1984 as his criticism of the Soviet Union, so that was a much more political story. But Bradbury actually doesn't really consider Fahrenheit 451 to be a political novel necessarily, because in his opinion, the issue that this novel touches on is much more of a social issue than a political one. Because in this novel, you find out that it was really the people who decided that they didn't need books anymore, and then the government decided to take advantage of this and come in and make books illegal, but the public had already started to ignore books anyway. So it was a social issue before it was a political issue. First of all, sorry about the dramatic change in lighting. I recorded the first part of this video last night, got tired and went to bed, and now I'm recording the rest of the video. You gotta understand that seldom do I actually record these videos straight through. I usually record them in segments and then put them together in editing. Now, while Bradbury claimed that politics were not really as important in this book as it is in a book like 1984, he was actually writing this book to commentate on certain things that were going on politically at the time this book was published. Like, obviously, all the themes of nuclear warfare in this book were commentating on the tensions between the US and the Soviet Union that were going on at the time. And he also has said that he was making a commentary on McCarthyism, and he was also commentating on the book burnings that the Nazis did. Obviously, that was not at the time he was writing this, but that was only a few short years in the past from when he wrote this book. Now, in a lot of ways, I would almost call Fahrenheit 451 an essay on the importance of reading to our society and to our culture, but it's an essay in the form of a story. And the book is really about how important reading is in terms of understanding the world around us and understanding our culture and other cultures, but it's also really important in terms of understanding the past, because you realize that the society of this novel is a society that is mostly forgotten in the past, like history is mostly forgotten in this society. And I actually do think reading is very important in terms of understanding history. For example, I think you could actually learn so much more about a specific time period reading a book that was written during that time period as opposed to reading a history book written now that's simply talking about said time period. Now, I'm not saying it's not important to read history books, because it is important to get, like, the historical context, but if you're interested in knowing how, for example, if you want to know how people thought during the 19th century, I feel like you could learn so much more about how people thought during that time period reading books that were written during said time period. For example, if you want to know how people thought during, like, Edgar Allan Poe's time, actually reading the stories of Edgar Allan Poe would give you great insight into that. And once again, this book is really about how important reading is in terms of understanding the past. And the book also talks about how important reading is in terms of personal memory, and since this is a culture that has outlawed reading, you realize that individual memory is pretty much fucked. For example, in the beginning of this story, Montag's wife overdoses on sleeping pills, not because she's suicidal, but because this culture has made her such a forgetful person that she actually forgotten how many sleeping pills she took. And also later on in the story, Montag asks her where we met, and she can't answer that question at all because she doesn't remember. And I feel like this book is so relevant today because I feel like in our society we place a lot less value on reading than we used to, and I do think that's a problem. But the story also states that it's not so much the books themselves, but the knowledge that the books contain, and the knowledge is the one thing that you can't take away from somebody who truly wants that knowledge. Now, with the character of Montag in this book, you get a really interesting commentary on the themes of individuality and free will. For example, prior to the events of this story, Montag was pretty much a puppet for the system, but when he starts rebelling against the system, he eventually meets this former English professor named Faber, and he more or less starts working for Faber at one point, and he starts to question his own free will because he starts to think, how is working for him and doing what he says any different from when I was doing everything that the fire department told me to do? But the fact that he's actually questioning this shows that he does have a choice. But the fact that he's questioning this is also an issue as well, because his entire culture has pretty much made him into a puppet and made him question his own freedom of choice. Now, I mentioned the character of Clarice, who in my opinion is a very important character in this story because she's really the one who sets Montag on this journey. Now, there's a quote from, I don't remember if it was Aristotle or Socrates who said this. I think it was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and I feel like that quote perfectly applies to the character of Clarice, because she's somebody who does examine life, which is something that people in her culture simply do not do. And you find out in this book that people call her antisocial, when in reality she's the exact opposite of what we would think of as antisocial. And she enjoys getting into deep conversations with people, which once again is something that people in this world don't do. Now, something tragic does happen to the character of Clarice earlier on in this story, and I I remember when I first read this book, I was actually really kind of upset by what happens to Clarice because I really liked that character, but I feel like the tragedy of what happens to Clarice is so integral to the story because it's another thing that really sets Montag on this journey. And then you have the character of Millie, who is Montag's wife, who is a character who, in a lot of ways, exemplifies everything that's wrong with this society, because she's constantly forgetting things, and you realize that it's her culture that has made her so forgetful. And she's also obsessed with and controlled by the technology around her, and once again, she's in a lot of ways an embodiment of what this culture is doing to people, and I actually did find Millie to be a sympathetic character because, in a lot of ways, she's simply a victim of the society of this novel. And then you have the character of Captain Beatty, who is the fire chief, who is Montag's boss, but also his friend and mentor. And Beatty, I think, is a very interesting character because he is the villain of the novel to a certain extent, but he's also a sympathetic character as well. Now, Beatty, in a lot of ways, represents the very system that Montag ends up rebelling against. At the same time, though, you realize that he's an extremely well-read man. Like, he actually has read a lot of books in the past. And there's actually a scene that Bradbury wrote after he published this book that he included in an afterwards in this edition of the novel, where basically Montag goes to Beatty's apartment and finds that he has tons of books in his apartment, but he says that it's not illegal to own books, it's illegal to read them. And it turns out that Beatty used to be a very avid reader, but a lot of tragedies have happened to him in his life that pretty much made him give up on books and made him think that he doesn't need books for happiness. If anything, the books made him more unhappy. So once again, he is a sympathetic character and a very compelling character, despite the fact that he is the villain of the novel. And also, I can't possibly talk about this book without also talking about Bradbury's brilliant writing. The writing style in this book is almost poetic in the way that it's written. Now, this book was adapted into a film of the same name in 1966. Now, I saw the movie for the first time recently, and it was actually really damn good. The only thing that's kind of funny about the movie is it's a movie that's set in the future, yet it's so rooted in 60s culture, but that really didn't bother me. I know a lot of people whine and moan and bitch when something is quote-unquote dated, but that really doesn't bother me at all. I actually thought it was interesting because for a movie that's set in the future, you see a lot of characters using like old-time phones that were actually old during the 60s. So it was sort of this weird amalgamation of the past and the future merged together. Now, the movie does change a lot from the book. Like, the character of Clarice is completely altered in the movie. And the movie also cuts out all the stuff about nuclear warfare, which was actually at Ray Bradbury's insistence, but I always felt like that added to the story, but it's completely cut out of the movie. And the ending of the movie is actually quite different, but I actually thought the ending of the film was quite beautiful, and even Bradbury himself commented on how beautiful the ending of the film is. And the movie also added some humor to the story. For example, there's a scene in the movie where the firemen are going through this park, looking through people's bags, making sure that they don't have books on them, and there's this really bizarre scene where Beatty finds a small book on a baby. It was obviously meant to be sort of a comedic scene, but it was very odd. Now, there's a really interesting scene in the movie where Montag and Captain Beatty are going through this secret library, and Beatty's going through all these books, and he's talking about why books need to be burned, and he picks up a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf and says, all the books Montag, which I thought was really interesting because there was this great sense of irony to that. But I do like the movie quite a bit. It doesn't 100% do justice to the book, but you could tell the director was trying to take the story and sort of make it his own. Bradbury also wrote a play adaptation of this book in the 70s, and there was also a radio drama based on this book. There was also a 2009 graphic novel adaptation of this book. Now, recently there was a made-for-TV adaptation of this book, which aired on HBO, actually this past Saturday. Unfortunately, I missed it, but I do want to check it out at some point. Now, in the movie, Michael B. Jordan plays Montag, and Michael Shannon plays Captain Beatty, and I'm actually excited to see the movie, mainly because of those two actors, because I like both those actors a lot. Unfortunately, I read one review of the movie, and they said the film was just okay, but I'm still gonna check it out at some point. Now, regardless of how this new Fahrenheit 451 movie is, I'm a little pissed off that for years, a director that I like a lot, Frank Darabont, has been trying to do a film adaptation of this book, but he has not been able to do it. But yeah, that was my review on Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and bye.